For decades, textbooks, museums, and archaeologists told a clear story. Humans reached the Americas near the end of the last ice age, roughly 13,000 to 15,000 years ago. It was neat, widely accepted, and seemed beyond dispute. But a discovery dated to around 130,000 years ago shattered that certainty. Buried beside the remains of a mastodon were signs that something had broken its bones with deliberate force long before modern history says anyone could have been there. If that interpretation is true, then the first Americans were not who we thought they were at all. They may not even have been modern humans. So what exactly was found, and why has it become one of the most controversial discoveries in archaeology? Before this discovery, the story of the Americas felt settled. In textbooks, documentaries, and university lectures, the first chapter was usually the same. Near the end of the last ice age, small bands of humans crossed from Asia into North America over the Bering Land Bridge, sometime around 13,000 to 15,000 years ago. This was the world of the Clovis first model, a clean, confident explanation built around spear points, mammoth hunters, and a migration that seemed to fit both archaeology and common sense. And that consensus was powerful because it felt orderly. It gave the peopling of the Americas a beginning, a root, and a timeline. Earlier claims had surfaced before, but many were disputed, fragmentary, or too weak to overturn the dominant narrative. So the deeper past of the continent remained, in the minds of most researchers, unreachable, empty, waiting. That was the old world. No humans in the Americas 130,000 years ago, no serious reason to think otherwise, and certainly no expectation that Southern California might hold evidence from a chapter of human history no one believed belonged there. Everything changed in late 1992 on a sunny day in Southern California during the expansion of State Route 54 in San Diego County. It was supposed to be routine work, heavy machinery cutting through earth, crews focused on a highway, not prehistory. Then the blades struck something strange. Bone fragments appeared in the dirt. Richard Cerruti, the paleontologist on site, noticed them almost immediately. These were not random scraps. They belonged to a massive mastodon. But the real shock came from the arrangement. A tusk stood embedded vertically in the soil. Bones were scattered in ways that did not look natural. Nearby lay large stones that did not match the fine-grained sediments around them, one weighing nearly 30 pounds. In that moment, an ordinary construction site began to look like something else entirely, not a burial, not an accident, but a scene. A scene that seemed to suggest force, breakage, and intention. What turned this from a strange construction site story into a scientific bombshell was the evidence built over decades. Richard Cerruti and colleagues at the San Diego Natural History Museum documented the site in detail. But the decisive breakthrough came later, when scientists from the United States Geological Survey analyzed the mastodon bones using uranium-thorium dating. In 2011 and 2012, those tests pushed the site back to roughly 130,000 years ago, far beyond the accepted human timeline for the Americas. Then came the forensic case. The study, later published in Nature, argued that the mastodon's limb bones had been broken while still fresh. Not dry, not fossilized, fresh. The fractures showed spiral patterns consistent with what archaeologists call green bone breakage, the kind produced when a heavy hammerstone strikes living bone to reach the marrow inside. To test that claim, researchers broke modern elephant bones with stones similar to those found at the site. The fracture patterns closely matched. The stones also showed wear marks, and crucially, they did not belong to the local geology. Someone or something appears to have carried them there. But this is exactly where the story becomes most dangerous, because the evidence is dramatic, and dramatic evidence can mislead. The strongest critics did not argue that the site was unimportant. They argued that the interpretation went too far. Accepting a human, or even hominin, presence in the Americas 130,000 years ago would require rewriting one of archaeology's deepest timelines. So the burden of proof had to be brutal. And the skeptic case is powerful. There were broken bones and large stones, yes, but there were no knapped stone tools, no hand axes, no spear points. Most importantly, no human remains. At a site this radical, critics argued, you would expect a clearer human signature than fractured mastodon bones and a few heavy rocks. Some suggested the bones may have been damaged by modern construction equipment during the highway work. Others argued natural processes could have displaced the stones. In other words, the site may be real, ancient, and still not prove what Cerruti's team claimed. And that is the tension at the heart of the mystery. Is this a lost chapter of human history or a spectacular over-interpretation? If the Cerruti mastodon site is real evidence of hominin activity, then the implications are staggering. This would not simply push back the human story of the Americas. It would explode it. Because 130,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had not yet spread across the world in the way they later would. The likely candidates would be other human relatives, Neanderthals, Denisovans, or perhaps even an older lineage like Homo erectus. And that creates an even deeper problem. Around that time, the Bering Land Bridge was submerged during a warm interglacial period. There was no simple walk into the Americas. If some hominin really reached this continent then, they may have crossed water. Not by accident, deliberately, which means planning, adaptation, and seafaring ability on a scale we do not normally grant to these ancient humans. So this is no longer just a debate about broken bones in California. It becomes a question about intelligence, migration, and the true limits of our extinct relatives. Not who came first, but what kinds of humans the Earth once allowed to become explorers. So where does that leave us? Not with certainty, not with closure. And that is exactly why the Cerruti mastodon site still matters. The discovery has not been universally accepted. The debate is ongoing. Critics still argue that the evidence is too indirect, the implications too radical, and the human signature too faint. Supporters argue that the fractures, hammerstones, dating, and geological context together point to something deliberate and ancient. The mystery remains unresolved. But unresolved does not mean unimportant. In some ways, it means the opposite, because archaeology is not only about what we know. It is about the fragile boundary between what seems impossible and what the Earth is still willing to reveal. And every so often, a site appears that does not fit the timeline, does not respect the consensus, and refuses to disappear. Maybe Cerruti will one day be disproven, or maybe it will become the first crack in a much older human story. Either way, the question it opens is now impossible to ignore. How many chapters of our past are still buried beneath our feet, waiting for history to catch up? And if Cerruti is even partially right, then this discovery does not stand alone. It joins a growing list of finds that seem to whisper the same unsettling message. The human story is older, stranger, and far less tidy than we were taught. Again and again, archaeology keeps uncovering evidence that appears too early, too far away, or too advanced for the timeline that came before it. Which raises a bigger possibility. Maybe the Cerruti mastodon site is not the anomaly. Maybe it is the warning, a signal that other chapters of deep human history are still buried, dismissed, or waiting in plain sight for someone to look at them differently. Because if ancient hominins really reached the Americas 130,000 years ago, then this is not just a story about one mastodon in California. It is the beginning of a much larger investigation into forgotten migrations, lost technologies, and how many impossible discoveries are still out there, waiting to break the timeline again. If you enjoy historical mysteries illuminated by science, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you on the next discovery.